Hello, this video is going to be a past paper walkthrough of the OCR June or May 2018 exam for the Cambridge National's IT qualification. This exam has got the unit code R012, R013 is the assignment version of this course. This exam paper would be worth 50% of your grade. The other 50% is coming from the other unit, the assignment. And this exam can be sat in both January and May, so really the winter and summer exam series. The only other key information on the front page really are the fact that the exam is 1 hour 45 minutes, which is quite long for a GCSE Cambridge National level exam, but that gives you a lot of time because actually the paper is out of 80 marks, which is again a decent amount. A lot of GCSEs have got papers which are 80 marks, but usually they're not quite as long here. So, generally the advice is for exam technique is to spend about 1 minute per mark. So, certain questions will be, say, 2 marks. That means you spend 2 minutes on that question. The idea of this is just so you don't run out of time. That's generally how the examiners are awarding it. It's not always that simple, right? Some questions are really easy and will take 5 seconds. Some questions are a bit harder and might take longer than a minute a mark. But the point is here, right? 80 minutes is, 1 hour 20? So you've got an extra 25 minutes here if you're following that strategy. This time, you've got free. I say free loosely here because it's not always this simple. You want to be spending checking once you finish, and also the reason why they give you quite a lot of time here is because, as we'll look at, and as you might know from doing other papers, they give you a lot of scenarios in Cambridge Nationals because it's a vocational paper, because it's quite work related. They give you scenarios and these take some time to read and understand, so you get spare time for this reason as well. You don't need anything else really to do. There's no calculators needed here at all. One thing which I'll just point out just to be sure is make sure you do use black ink. Sounds quite strict, but it's because the papers are scanned in and colours don't show up well. Don't use a pencil, use just a normal black pen, but don't use anything else. And also because it is getting scanned, it is relevant, the information here, to make sure you're writing in the space. As I go, I will not follow this at all because I'm able to just write anywhere, but because it's being scanned, don't write over barcodes or on blank pages. If you finish or if you need more space, ask an invigilator for additional paper, because that paper will be attached properly and will be scanned properly. If you're just writing in a random space, maybe on the front page, it won't get scanned, so just be really careful and just ask for more paper if you need it. So anyway, I've got a bit off track from my introduction here. The point of this video is for me to go through this paper and show you my sample answers. I'm not going to talk through every single possible answer, of course. There are so many possible answers to questions which are given in this paper. It's also hopefully useful for me I will be trying to talk through some misconceptions and some common mistaken answers though, so hopefully that will help. You can read, if you prefer to, the mark scheme, something called the examiner's report, and also some sample answers on the exam board's website. They may be useful as well. I'm going to ignore them for now because otherwise it's just pointless if I just repeat the mark scheme, but they are available on the exam board's website if you want to see it. Now, because there are not many papers available for this qualification at the time of recording, I'd recommend you try this paper yourself. Sit down in front of your computer, print it out, whatever you need to do to just try and do this paper yourself, ideally in fake exam conditions. Turn your phone off, ignore your notes or textbook or whatever it is, and just try and do this question paper. The more practice is really so valuable for revising for exams. What I would say is, if you are not quite sure about this qualification, if you haven't revised much already before trying it, make sure you do revise. And it would be a mistake of me if I don't mention the fact that I have got a set of videos which covers all the content required for this exam. It's a long playlist. 7 hours is how long it would take if you watched it back to back. That would drive you insane, so break it up. But it is a long playlist because there's a lot of information to learn for this course, and the exam board could ask you about any of the stuff included in my playlist. Or I hope that's the case. So just bear that in mind. You can't just walk into this exam and be able to answer it. You've got to make sure you have spent time learning the content, which is really specific sometimes and really long, quite frankly. The only other thing to say is, if you are going to try this properly yourself, and then maybe mark it using my video or using the mark scheme, you want to tally up your marks, count up your marks, and to see how you did, what is important is you are looking for the grade boundaries. And to find out the specific grades for this actual exam, make sure you Google something like Cambridge National Grade Boundaries June 2018 or whatever paper it is, whatever year it says in the front, just to make sure you're seeing the right ones, because the grade boundaries do change year on year. They don't change massively, but if a paper is particularly hard, they'll change it. So make sure you scroll down to CIT and the different marks for each grade are listed here. You can see to get the highest grade, a distinction star, You can drop 25 marks, which is actually quite a lot for the highest grade in other subjects. So there is a little bit of wiggle room here. I don't want to say that to make you complacent, but there is a little bit of room here, but they do drop off quite quickly. To get the lowest grade, a pass at level 1, which is equivalent to about a 1 at GCSE grading, you need to get 12 out of 80, so not many marks at all, but these are relatively low grades. Be aware that a distinction at level 1, D1 is a distinction, but it's at level 1, which is what, like a 4, maybe less, a 3 maybe, so don't get too distracted by the distinction. We're aiming hopefully for level 2 at least, so the upper end. Best get started then on this paper. So first of all, the first section of these exam papers is going to consist of pretty much relatively short questions. Before the first scenario is introduced, the questions tend to be quite short. This is the first paper, so the formatting is a little bit different now, but generally the first set of questions are just a case of you putting down on paper what you've learned. So if you have not spent time revising all the specific content, this first section might be quite tricky. First of all, we're told we're working on a project and need to set milestones. In which phase of our life cycle will this task be carried out? We've got initiation, we've got planning, we've got execution and evaluation are our 4 phases of our life cycle. And milestones are set, I would say, in planning, but you could also say initiation here. Planning is, I think, a better answer because, milestones we're setting for doing things like Gantt charts, and we do those planning documents in planning, funnily enough, but you could say initiation here, that would be alright. We're now given a part of a Gantt chart, not really obvious here, but we've got the 2 different bars. That's how you can spot a Gantt chart against different times. You can see this dependency here. But what we're asked is, what does the first column A, represent? It's not got the label here. So column A, where we are producing the deliverable product and carrying out testing, this would be our tasks, right, or activities, the different things we're doing, and then it tells us how long it is. In the third question, we're now asked one software type that could be used to create a visualization diagram. A visualization diagram is really a depiction of what you think a product is going to look like. Maybe I'm defining an interface and I do a little diagram where I have like a menu, maybe a drop down menu coming down, maybe I've got like a picture over here, maybe I've got some buttons down here, like a terrible diagram, but that's what it might be, like a rough diagram of what you want to do. It'll be done during planning again. But what software could we use to do this? Well, we have a few different software types, so things like presentation software, spreadsheet software, database software, project management software, but really we're looking for more creative bits of software. So I would say the best one here to put would be desktop publishing. Desktop publishing software are things like Microsoft Publisher, or even arguably things like Photoshop, where you are able to use drawing tools to drag and drop things, and it's more focused on design. Using a spreadsheet to make this is not suitable really. You could do it, but it's not suitable. Also say things like presentation software, I suppose here would be alright. Word processing may be okay too. But I would say generally, let's stick to desktop publishing for our more creative tasks. And in question 4, we're told a food manufacturer is using a consumer panel to collect feedback on its new range of healthy snacks. Give 2 advantages of using a consumer panel to collect this feedback. So we've got different data collection methods, right? Loyalty schemes, surveys, using email, consumer panels, etc., etc. And really we're looking for what is particular about a consumer panel, which is maybe different to an email, a survey, whatever you're doing. So a consumer panel is where you've got a group of people meeting to really discuss a product. Here it's a food manufacturer, so maybe they're giving this snack to the people on the panel to try, maybe 10 people, maybe 15. And usually a panel is meeting a few times. Maybe this manufacturer convenes a panel in 1 month, gives them a first version of a product, in the second month a second version, and gets feedback. So what's good about having an actual panel in front of you? Well, I'd say what's really valuable is you get instant and direct feedback from your customers. I wouldn't say quick, right, because an email is quick, but you are getting instant feedback here. They're right in front of you. You can get direct feedback and there is no delay in this. Another good advantage here, you're able to, I suppose, assemble a diverse panel. So a panel made up of different demographics. If you're emailing one person, they might have different views to somebody who's older or younger, who is from a different country and so on. You are able to have a diverse panel here. And the point of this is so you can have a wide range of views. And perhaps you could say at once, right? You're not having to email loads of people. You're able to quickly get a wide range of different opinions from hopefully different demographics. I realise I can't multitask, so it doesn't quite make sense here, but if you say something like if you assemble, maybe add that a bit of a start there to make it make more sense. Now, because we're bouncing around quite a lot in this first section, we are told that farming is one type of threat which exists when you're collecting data online. What is meant by the term farming? So farming is arguably a type of social engineering where when an attacker is trying to manipulate a human to fall for giving up some personal information. So farming is a particular type of this attack where the attacker is creating a fake website and then getting the user to fall for it and believe it's real and put their information that goes to the attacker, not to the actual website. So it's where attackers impersonate a trusted website in order to gain personal information. That would be enough for 2 marks. Hopefully you can see how the examiner might be marking it. Thinking exam technique is worth 2 marks. The examiner is looking for 2 distinct points. So we've got 1 point here, the point of the fact that it's a website being impersonated, being copied really. And the second point is what we're doing in this attack, where we're trying to obtain personal information. You could go into more detail, and you could also say that farming usually, or not always, advanced farming attacks use slightly more technical skills to actually possibly redirect the victims. I won't write this up, but that's what could be being done. This means really, say the victim types in paypal.com. PayPal is a common website which is used for farming. If the attacker's got technical skills, they can kind of change this. So maybe it says paypal.com instead, a fake website. And the victim, when they type it in, may not realise that it's changed, may not even notice it's changed. But actually this is the attacker's website where they can enter their password and it gets sent to the attacker instead of PayPal. That's more technical, but generally it's about impersonating a trusted website, copying what it looks like, and just getting information that way. For question 6, we're told we are releasing a deliverable product to a client. And just to say what this is before we actually look at the question, this is what we are making in our project. A lot of our project is us designing stuff, planning things, and then actually creating whatever it is, either a physical product, or maybe it's a system on a computer, and the system can be physical too. But it could be a bit of software, maybe a website, whatever it is. It's what we are doing for our client, and we are giving it to them at the end of our project. Now that's quite key for the question, which is during which phase of the life cycle does this task take place, where we are we're handing over our product to the client? Well, I said it's only when we finish our project life cycle, and therefore it'll be the last phase. And the last phase is, as hopefully you know, evaluation. A common misconception here would be saying execution. Execution would be, unfortunately, wrong. We do actually make our deliverable product in execution. We also test it in execution, but we're not actually giving it to the client yet because we're not finished. We've got a whole new phase to do afterwards. We've got to evaluate it. And also in evaluation, we do things like producing documentation. You're not going to hand over a complex bit of software to a client before you've written up a manual or some evidence that it's working and so on. So you've got to do a few more things before it's completely done and you can give it over to your client. For question 7, we've got a retailer showing information about new products with its store managers using Voice over Internet Protocol, shortened to VoIP. And we need to describe one advantage to the retailer of using VoIP to share this information, which is really important because we could talk a lot about the managers or about customers or about families talking over Skype, but actually this is here to the retailer, to this little scenario here. So VoIP is really how things like Skype or Zoom or Microsoft Teams meetings work. It's how they're able to send mostly audio, hence the word voice, over the internet. So really it's having a telephone call over the internet. Nowadays we have video too associated with it, but initially it was just sound. So what is an advantage to the retailer of using this? Well, maybe they could send emails, right? They could send email to the store managers, but what's better about actually calling somebody? Well, you can have a conversation. So you could say VoIP allows a two-way conversation in almost real time. It's not a perfect connection. It's not the same as talking to them in person. But as you may know from using things like Zoom, there is a slight delay sometimes in almost real time. And so really, it's a describe question, meaning I can't just write my answer. I'm saying I've got to say, why is it good? So this would be 1 mark here. The fact that it's a two-way conversation, that shows we've understood what this protocol is. But to describe it, why is that an advantage? Well, perhaps so questions can be answered immediately. If it was sent over email, it would take a bit of time. There is always a temptation for questions like this to not focus on the actual scenario it gives. So talking about something unrelated, something too general, try and be specific. So I've said answered questions here. That's relevant if they're launching a new product. It's not relevant if it's a family having a nice chat. They're not really answering questions. Also, another issue, so B on my two problems, is people saying things like it's cheaper or it's faster or something fairly generic and something which could apply to loads of different things. It's got to be specific. Why is this very particular way of sharing information an advantage in this case? Saying it's quicker or cheaper, I mean, is it really? Is it cheaper than using email? Well, not really. You can get things for free or cheaply. So just be careful. Try and make it specific to the scenario, and don't just write the most obvious advantage. Try and think about why it's particular to this concept. Okay, and for question 8, we've got a scenario here. Now, in the newer formats, these will be a bit clearer, I would say, and also it will be a new section likely. So we have a project team set up. It's been set up to organise the installation of a cashless payment system in a school over the summer holiday, and the new payment system must be ready for the first day of term. Now, at this stage, I'd be tempted to get my highlighter out. It's a good idea having a highlighter coming in, or just underline it maybe in your pen, because you want to be looking for information which is likely to be needed in future questions. A lot of this stuff is not directly important for later questions. Of course, I don't know if it's going to ask about it being ready for the first day of term, but having done past papers before and knowing about things like constraints, I'm thinking, well, that's probably quite relevant. What is also relevant, I suspect, is it saying the school has got a total budget of £20,000 to set up this new system. So it's got a budget, that's quite specific, that might be useful later. And there will be 2 checkouts in the canteen. Each will have a barcode scanner. A fingerprint reader will be used to identify each student of a checkout. I might be thinking here biometrics. I've got something going on here, quite personal information being collected. It's quite sensitive, this information. Could be a question. When a student wants to buy a meal, they'll take the items to the checkout, sign in with their fingerprint and scan the food item barcodes. The total cost will be calculated and displayed on a touchscreen. The student will then confirm the purchase by touching the OK button. They can also cancel their purchase if a meal costs too much, and the system is going to generate a total bill at the end of the week, and it's sent to each student's home by email. That might be relevant. I mean, a lot of this information we're just going to be able to refer back to, but the stuff in the middle here, I'm not actually making the system, so you could argue it's not needed, but let's see as we go through. Before we do though, I would say when we give you a scenario, take your time to read it. I don't know, take 3 minutes to read it. It might take longer or shorter, depending on how long it is or short it is, but try and understand it, try and think about the scenario, picture yourself involved somehow maybe, get your head inside it, because the next set of questions are going to be related to it. They're often going to need you to refer to it and think like you are the manager or the school or whoever is involved in the scenario. So don't just skip over it. It's tempting just to go, okay, great, that's fine, and move on. Take your time and don't be scared to refer back to it for each question if you need to. So first of all, we need to identify one input into the initiation phase for this project. Okay, so initiation is our first phase, and the 2 inputs to this, which you just have to learn, they are on the specification, are the user requirements and the user constraints. So we could just write either one here. We could just say, well, one input is going to be the school's requirements. You could just write literally user requirements here, but the school's requirements. This is what that middle section is really about. This bit I skipped over kind of, about what actually it needs to be like on the checkout. We're not really worried about it for now, but that would be an input. And one output from planning, so our second phase, well, again, if you've just learned the specification, which unfortunately is my job to do, you'll know that on the spec it says outputs from planning are things like your constraints again are also outputted. There'll be a phase review, which is an output, and also you'll have project plans and also test plans, which should be done during this phase. And so I would stick to things like, what is done at planning. We're making planning tools, things like Gantt charts, things like visualization diagrams, etc. So we could just say this really, project plan is maybe a safe answer. But if you wanted to, you could say things like Gantt charts, but I'd tend to stick fairly generic here. Project plans, maybe let's make this making more sense. It should be 2 easy marks. If you've not learnt it, then you're just kind of like grasping the different things here. So just learn the outputs and inputs to each phase. It'll take some time, but it makes these questions dead easy. For question 9, We are told, as they should do, if a project manager is considering legislative implications during both initiation and planning. So legislative and legislation refers to laws. So the laws, what the government says, things you must follow. Otherwise you'll be in trouble, usually a fine or maybe even prison. If you break a law, you could go to prison, of course. So what is one legal implication which must be considered for this project? So I'd say the two most relevant laws are the Data Protection Act and also the Computer Misuse Act. So the DPA and the CMU. Computer Misuse Act, or I say CMU when I mean CMA. Don't usually use the acronym, to be fair to me. The two main laws relevant for this sort of thing. I would say here, what is the main issue? Is it about making sure data is kept secure, or is it about stopping hackers? I would say a school canteen is not a massive target for hackers. So I would say most relevant one here is the Data Protection Act, making sure personal data is kept secure and is not going to get just deleted or emailed to the wrong person or that sort of stuff. So not about like attackers, just about often carelessness usually. So they must consider the fact that personal information is being stored. You could give an example if you really want to be on the scenario. I don't think it's needed, but you could say, e.g. the fingerprint is the first thing which I really noticed when I was reading it, in that this is really quite sensitive. Because we have unique fingerprints, that's pretty identifiable, right? You could find somebody just from a fingerprint, so it's quite important we keep it secure. And so just for a second mark here, the Data Protection Act must be followed. It's always good to use the law's name just to show you've understood it and have learnt it. Okay, so I think also it does say no, I was looking to see if it said it must be kept secure, but it doesn't say that. So that'd be alright. Again, looking for our 2 marks. Have we made 2 points? Make the examiner's life easy. Well, why do we need to do this? Well, we must consider it because we're doing this, storing personal information, and so it's covered under the Data Protection Act. I think you'd struggle to talk about other laws because it's just not as obvious. You also need to make sure the examiner's happy that you are focused on the scenario. So this example here is not needed, I wouldn't say, but it does show the examiner you are focused on the scenario. You haven't just ignored this big paragraph, or 3 paragraphs. So just keep it on the scenario, otherwise you're just running a risk. So for question 10, we've got, 8 marker, always fun. So the team will follow the project lifecycle to complete this project, discuss the advantages to the school of it being completed using a project lifecycle. So using the thing you've learned about: initiation, planning, execution, evaluation, and the different inputs and outputs. Very specific, this project lifecycle. Why is following it an advantage to the school in this case? So I don't really care about the students, I don't really care about the people working in the canteen, I don't really care about parents, I care about the school organising this project, which it suggests to me maybe that it's an external team, and so it's not teachers or not IT staff at the school, it might be some other people coming in. Why does the school care whether they're using the project lifecycle, not just doing it randomly? So I said a little bit sarcastically, these are fun questions. They actually are easier than you might seem, because usually for short mark questions you get as many marks as you make valid points. But I made 2 valid points here, they're connected, I got 2 marks. I made 1 valid point here, I got 1 mark. It's usually that simple for questions less than, say, 7 marks, but longer than this, the examiner is going to mark it using levels. So there'll be level 1, level 1, level 2, level 3. And this will be true in other subjects too, when we have long mark questions. And these are less simple to mark, because the examiner is not just ticking off different points, and if you get 8 points, you get 8 marks. It's not quite as simple there. Here, the examiner is looking to see sort of your general quality, and the mark scheme will say things like, have they said at least 1 advantage, and have they explained it? This might be described, this might be stated. So we're looking for a few advantages here, which are fully explained if you want to get the top band here. And I say this only because I'm always tempted to do half as many points as there are marks. I'll be tempted to do 4 points here, 4 advantages, each worth hopefully 2 marks to try and get 4 marks. But actually it's not always that simple. If you made 3 points and explained them, that'd be great. Even if you made 2 points and really explained them, that might be enough to get 4 marks or close to 4 marks. So just bear this in mind. But you may as well, if we can, try and do 4 points. It makes things a lot safer. And I'll be tempted here just to try and like bullet point maybe at the top your reasons, your planning reasons, your advantages, just so you can plan your answer just quickly is how I would do it. Don't spend more than a minute on this, but just helps you make a nice cohesive answer as you are writing it. So why is following the life cycle you've learnt about going to be good for the school? Well, first of all, I think a really important and overlooked aspect of the life cycle is phase reviews. So the idea that at the end of every phase, the project manager is going to sit down and check off, have the team followed all the steps inside that phase, have things been done properly, do things need to be done again, called iteration. And the school, even if they're not really involved in actually doing a project, they can go, okay, I'm going to read the phase review from planning, it looks like things are okay, and that's great. So really, we'll be able to keep track of a project by just following the phase reviews, and if they've got issues, they can intervene if they feel it's going to go off track. So I've said having these phase reviews being produced means that someone at the school can read them, or sit in the meeting, or whatever it is, and hopefully be confident that things are being done properly. They don't have to stand over the technician's shoulder all the time. They're able to just check it after each week, maybe, however long a phase might take. And if it is not progressing well, they are able to intervene, maybe. I think I could probably explain that more. If I was struggling for advantages, I might look for more here. And I started writing without really finishing my plan, which was a mistake. You do your plan first, then actually write it. So let's do a few more points here. I'd say another advantage is that it's not directly to the school, but usually the advantage of a life cycle is it's really clear to every team member what they need to do and at what stage things are getting done. Because it's been decided beforehand, really, there's no confusion and uncertainty. So that's an advantage to the workers here. But in terms of a school, it means it's not going to be wasted time, maybe fewer mistakes, which will be good for the school. So we've got to make sure we're careful with that point that we are saying to the school and not to some technician working on a project. Other advantages might be kind of adherence to constraints. Constraints are treated really importantly. Things like, I'm pretty sure it said about what the budget and it's got to be ready first day of term. Those constraints, pretty important, they're met. Let's do maybe another one. What about, we said constraints about requirements, right? Making sure the team members are aware of requirements. It means the deliverable product will be more likely to be what the school expect when it's finished. So let me write these up one by one. So I've said having this predetermined structure means the team members will have less uncertainty and make fewer mistakes. Ideally, it may not actually quite be true. Now, if I stopped here and moved on, the examiner will read it and not care at all, because this is not relevant to the school unless I make it clear why this is relevant to the school. So let's do that now. It's relevant because, well, for the school, resources, things like physical equipment or money and so on, resources and time will be wasted less, at least. It may not be totally not wasted, but it may be wasted less if we haven't got the confusion and so on. And you could kind of link it to the next point if you wanted to. I'm probably not going to bother, but same about constraints. The fact that there is this early awareness of constraints means they're less likely to be broken. And it's a good place here to link it to the scenario so you've understood it and have read it, like the budget, which was £20,000, and also it needs to be ready for term, like the budget. And so always making sure we're linking it to the school. Here it's not a direct link, admittedly, but the point being, unless the constraints are made clear, the team members will not be aware of it necessarily. Unless you are telling them the budget is £20,000, they might spend £30,000 because you haven't told them. It's not really their fault unless they've been told really clearly. But also, what is also important here is that if it's clear it cannot be done in this budget or timescale, then they can abort the project at a really early stage. So to try and link it to the school again, I've said if after the feasibility report, which is where during initiation they basically go, okay, we've got these requirements and these constraints, is it possible to do it? If it's not possible, they can just end the project at that stage. It does happen sometimes, they just end after the first stage because it's just not possible. Why is this good? It's kind of a new point here really. Well, this reduces wasted time and also money, right? You can end it early, there's no point going on if it's just not possible. So, okay, I did say we're going to do one more point on requirements. Probably if I was looking at this, I'll be thinking, yeah, that's probably right. Maybe not, well, hopefully for 8 marks, but I'm getting I'm getting 7, 8 marks at least there, I would say. Hopefully 8. But maybe to make it certain, you could add in that point about requirements. Bear in mind, like I showed at the start, you can drop quite a few marks to still get fairly high grades. So if you're not getting full marks in these questions, that's not really a big deal. Make sure you're trying every single question here, because it's a band. If you're making, say, 1 point and you are explaining it, maybe just my kind of turquoise colour here, you might get, 4 marks here, maybe 6 marks maybe. So just always write stuff down. I think if I was not as lazy as I am, I'd write down about requirements and the fact that the team members are really clear about requirements, but probably this would be enough for at least the top band mark, if not full marks, let's hope at least. But those are the sort of reasons we need to talk about. Why is following this really clear structure of really clear tasks going to be beneficial to the school, not to the team members, not to pupils, to the school? These sort of reasons would be good. Okay, and in 11A, I've kind of actually done this in my answer, but 2 constraints for this project are the time scale and also the budget. So we could be more specific here, but usually for short mark questions it's not that important. But time, it needs to be start of term, ready for start of term, and budget was £20,000. A constraint is something which we must, if we're doing a project, must adhere to. We cannot break this. Right, if I finish this project at Christmas, that's way too late. I've broken the time constraint. If I spend £25,000, I'm again breaking the constraint and my project has failed. So we've got to be really careful not to deviate from this. I'm asked how we can mitigate one of these. Describe one step that could be taken to mitigate this. So mitigation is the fact that, I can't change either of these things. I can't magically beg the school for, I say magically, I can't beg the school for more money. It's just not going to happen. I need to find a way, if I'm managing this project, to make sure I'm not going to break this. So mitigation is about reducing risk of something bad happening. Let's talk about, I think time is probably easier here. So I'm going to choose time as my constraint. Make sure it's one of these two you've written down above. So how can I reduce the risk of us running out of time and overrunning my project? So I think here we're looking at things like scheduling. Are you going to make a Gantt chart? Are you going to spend time in planning, mapping out the exact milestones? That's really important. We could write this, but one I really like to write about is contingency time. So contingency time is time set aside in a plan where you've basically said, I'm doing nothing here, but if something gets delayed or there are some issues, I can use that time set aside to not overrun. If your Gantt chart has got loads of tasks back to back and your deadline is here, what happens if one of these tasks takes a bit longer? It means all of them take a bit longer and you overrun. If you've got some nice contingency time kind of set aside for you, it means if one of them overruns, you can kind of use up this contingency time without affecting your deadline. That's what it's there for. So I'm going to say the schedule produced could have contingency time set aside, which can be used if there are any unforeseen issues, and so it will reduce the risk of a delay breaking that constraint. So to make it a describe answer, I want to take the examiner through my thinking. So I'm saying it reduces the risk of one delay breaking the constraint. A slightly pointless sentence, to be quite honest, but it shows I've kind of thought about it. The point being, if I've got a really, really tight schedule, there's no room for error. I want to ideally have a bit of slack time where I can use it up if things go wrong. I think budget is a little bit harder to have a nice, clear, specific answer for, but you could have said things like, well, I'm going to make sure I'm not wasting money. I'm going to maybe get the cheapest software or the cheapest resources available without affecting quality. Those sort of things are there to reduce waste, and at the start maybe ensure you've got a bit of spare money in case things go wrong, something breaks or something like this. So really have contingency money, I suppose, as well as time. A contingency is generally just a backup, really, if things go wrong. So moving on to a new scenario here, it would be a new section if this was a newer style exam paper. We have an athletics club called Progress Harriers organising a monthly competition. This competition includes a variety of sporting events. The results of this are posted on the club website and sent to all competitors as an email attachment. I'm thinking, well, websites could be an IT question. It's unlikely to be about athletics, so emails are relevant here for us. And they use a database to store and process data such as event results, club event records, and the contact details of each competitor. So we are processing of a database, which is interesting, but it says they are. The database is stored on a laptop and it is protected by a password. At the start of each competition, the laptop is used by club officials to record the names of the competitors in a database table. And during each competition, a desk is set up at the side of the events field where the competition is being held. The results of each sporting event are brought by club officials to the desk, and this data on the position and time for each competitor is input into the database using the laptop. Okay, I kind of switched off a little bit reading that, to be honest. It seems like not all of this is massively relevant. I suppose the idea is we have this portable laptop, officials are entering the data, and there's a lot of movement around, so they're brought to the officials. Okay, let's leave it and see what the questions are about. So they are concerned, this club, about the use of social engineering by cyber criminals. I said earlier this is about where the attack is manipulating the human. It's less a technical attack, more about a psychological way of exploiting a human being gullible, usually. So for part A, what type of social engineering could take place during a competition? Just for 1 mark here. There are different types you need to know about, things like pretexting, phishing, farming, arguably, quid pro quo, baiting, shouldering. I'm sure I've forgotten one in there. It might come back to me. So thinking here, what is most relevant? Well, you could say phishing, I suppose. But what could you say phishing? Is phishing most relevant here? It doesn't mention emails, but it's for clubs sending emails. So I'd say it's not a massive risk. I think probably here you'd get a mark if you just listed one of our valid types. I think, reading it, this idea about entering information and entering a password, a highlighted password, what is most likely to affect a password? Well, shouldering is a nice one to mention. Shouldering is where somebody literally stands over somebody's shoulder, or at least can observe them entering some information like a password. Really simple, but fairly common as well. Another one which I think quid pro quo, where you're doing something as a favour really, is not massively relevant here. So maybe you wouldn't get a mark, you put that. I think baiting could be one. You could leave a dummy laptop or leave a USB stick lying around and it might have malware on, that sort of thing. But I think shouldering is probably our safest option. But it's a 1 mark question. The examiner's not going to be too harsh here. But what is a bit harder is to explain one way the club could mitigate against the threats from social engineering. So again, mitigate meaning reducing the impact of, reducing the risk of it happening, for 3 marks here. So only one way. If you listed 3 ways here, you'd get 1 mark. It's got to be a one way. You can't just list loads of ways. You've got to adhere to the question. So different ways we could do, well, they could make sure staff are trained. They could install loads of fences. It sounds stupid, but if you've got a massive fence blocking like people in a crowd and the laptop's over here, it means an attacker can't see the password getting typed in. Those sort of things you could say. The one I love to write about really is training. So training is really important in that you are able to sit your staff down, sit your athletes down and talk to them about the threats. Okay, social engineering is this, different types are these, what you can do to spot it is this, this and this, and helps them hopefully be able to recognise it if it's happening and also prevent it happening in the first place. Okay, so I've written a very long sentence here which is not very great, it's not great English. I could have broken it up more. I did add in having different types of social engineering, it might be relevant as well. Really I'm looking for 3 points here, making sure it's all one way, right? 3 points on the same method. I can't just talk about like fences here or some other method. It's got to be one way only. I could add an example. I could say EEG training, how to spot, or EEG telling staff to check over their shoulder before they enter a password. You could be more specific if you had time, sort of thing you might add in if you'd finished early and you're checking your work. But here's a relatively safe answer for now. For question 13, we need to identify 1 physical prevention measure and 2 logical prevention measures that progress harriers could take to protect its data. So a prevention measure is really just some method to stop, to try and reduce the risk or impact or whatever of a cyber attack. So, or just some event like a flood or something like this. So physical one is something we can basically touch. Logical, can we touch it? No. It is a simple way of just learning the difference. So physical things tend to be relatively obvious sounding things like having physical walls or fences. So maybe you could, in this case, could fence off the athletics track. You don't need to explain why yet, unless you picked it in part B. The idea here is, my thinking here is, having a member of the public be able to walk on the track and maybe walk over to officials' area runs a risk they could be trying to shoulder or trying to blag or something like this. So it reduces that risk. A logical one, things like kind of your stock ones to have learned are things like having anti-malware software installed. Malware software installed on the laptops here. And another good one to write is always passwords. Passwords are really important, and it does say it here unfortunately, which kind of ruins our chance of using it. So a better one to say, which is not just repeating the scenario, is things like having encryption. So you could encrypt data on the laptop. The idea being that if that password could get guessed somehow, if a laptop was stolen maybe, the attacker wouldn't be able to read the data because it's been scrambled up and is unreadable to anybody who's not authorized, is the idea. But we don't have to explain it unless we pick it for the next question. So using one of them, describe how it would protect the data. So I think here, you can pick any one here, and I've kind of explained my thinking behind it, but let's just do anti-malware software because I don't think I explained that one particularly. So the idea of anti-malware software is it's able to scan all the time. It scans for malicious software, which is what malware is, things like viruses, worms, trojans, etc. And if any of them are found, it gets removed. If we didn't have this software installed, malware might be able to delete or change some of our data. So saying the scanning and removing is probably enough for 2 marks, but let's just be safe and say without it, data could be damaged. Now what would actually happen here depends on the type of malware and what the attacker's trying to do. It could be data being deleted if the attacker doesn't care. It could be modified, maybe they're trying to cheat or something like this. Just depends, but that's the general point, right? Scanning and removing it. So we're still on this scenario. They use a database to process data about the competition results. The reason why when I went through this now, I was kind of surprised at processing. You don't usually process data in a database. It's more just for storing data, but no matter. We need to describe one feature of a database that could help progress carriers enter data into its database. So just in terms of how we can enter data, and I will say these questions on databases versus spreadsheets tend to be answered quite poorly. If you've had a chance to answer the assignment, R013, using either a spreadsheet or database, or both ideally, they really help with these questions, so you just can understand the key features. If you don't know, a database is really usually just a set of tables. A set of tables connected in some way, stores lots of data. Usually there's some relationship. Maybe we've got here, like this might be an athlete, one table, and it might be their times. The idea being that one athlete could run for 200 meters 3 times and have different times each time. I've messed up that drawing, but the point is we have these connections. Not relevant for the first question here, but is how a database usually works. So how could the database software help the officials enter data into it? Well, usually we can, as a designer of a system, set up an entry form. So you could say a data entry form. Not specific to a database, but is okay. Data entry form. Enable the data to be typed in what is a fairly user-friendly, guided interface. The idea being that I could just, in my table, type in the information myself directly into the table, which would you want an official who doesn't know much about IT to do? Probably not. You'd probably rather we have, instead of this being shown to them, they just get shown a form with name, time, event, etc. They press submit down here. It goes into the table automatically. They don't have to go into the table directly. This is a slightly nice user-friendly interface. It's guided. There might be some instructions at the top. Better than going straight into the table. Not unique to a database, but it is a feature of most database software. So for part B, we need to describe one feature of the database that could help them generate useful information from its database. So I think probably what would be helpful if I say the key main things about a database they're going to ask you about. So I would say the idea that you have forms, not specific databases, but they are there. What are pretty much specific are things like reports. So a report is really what it's looking for here. A report is a way for you to extract key information from your tables, often plural, multiple tables, into a fairly nice user interface, a fairly nice clean format. Looking at loads of tables is quite hard, but if you generate a report using various criteria, it is much more user-friendly. Also, databases, not really relevant here, but the idea of you can use queries is quite important. You can write what is really a question to the database and get responses back. So for instance, you can go, okay, I want to get all the times less than 12 seconds for the 100 meters, and it would be able to take this, and if you did it properly, it could create a report based on this information. So we could say query here, and you'd pretty much get a mark for using the two keywords, reports, queries. So let's say report instead of a query, just because a report is, I think, better for this case and really uses the same sort of idea as a query. So a report can be used to extract information according to criteria in a user-friendly format. So it doesn't show you it in a massive table. It will be much more concise and specific based on your criteria. So like I say, it could be, your criteria could be, it's got to be times under 12 seconds. It might give you the name, date it was done, and track, maybe something like that. If it's a query, the idea being that you can use a query to specify certain fields you want to match or meet certain criteria, and then after the query is returned, you'll get the subtable containing just the information you've asked for, like times under 12 seconds, for example. So a report is unique to a database, really. It's not in a spreadsheet, but part C is a little bit harder because we need to now actually contrast a database to a spreadsheet. So we need to give two reasons why they would want to use a database rather than a spreadsheet to do what they're doing, to record event results, club event records, and the contact details of each competitor. Right, so a spreadsheet is different to a database in that a spreadsheet can look very similar to a database, but you can have loads of tables in a database, right? In a spreadsheet. It's very similar. Like a spreadsheet would be something like Excel, Microsoft Excel, whereas a database something like Access. You may have used one or the other or both, ideally, at this point. So a spreadsheet is a bit different. In a spreadsheet, it's much more about processing. You can process in a database using something called using calculated fields. But as you'd have hopefully known by now, a spreadsheet is pretty good at doing little calculations, doing bits of maths, generating nice little charts maybe. Much easier to do in a spreadsheet than it is in a database. Not really what it's designed for. So I would say here, first of all, this is the first time I've talked about this, but usually we don't process in a database. We can do, but we don't usually. It's not really its main purpose. And it does say here we're just recording these things. We're not really processing at this stage. So really, a database is usually where you dump your data, then to process it, you can either use a calculated field if it's a fairly small thing, or extract it into a spreadsheet is usually where you do your processing. So I would say, because these are being recorded, so really just being stored, they do not need to use the processing features of a spreadsheet. So perhaps not the greatest point to start with here, because I'm kind of saying, well, why are spreadsheets good, just not for this purpose? But it is valid, right? But you're just recording the data here. We're just storing it. We don't need to process it at this stage, according to this brief question. So really, using a spreadsheet is not needed here, right? You always want to choose the most suitable software. And our second point, well, we could talk about the fact that a database, because we're just storing stuff and we're storing different entities, so we've got 3 different entities, event results, event records, and contact details are all connected, all related. Therefore, what I was trying to talk about up here about these relationships is best suited with a database. You can kind of fiddle around and try and do it in a spreadsheet, maybe in different sections, but it's not the most suitable. So let's say each of these different entities are separate, and it would make sense to store them separately, but in a database we are able to connect them using relationships, and that would help us extracting information later on. Alright, so I've changed my answer a little bit to what I just said. I've now said each of these 3 entities are separate, and it would be most logical to store them in a different table, in different tables. However, they are related, and a database can model this relationship, the idea being that we can, using something called a primary key and a foreign key, link different tables using this relationship, and it is pretty logical and also pretty efficient. You could save that as well as a separate point. It's quite an efficient way to store it, so you get small file sizes. Anyway, that's unrelated. So because we've got this relationship, we are able to use queries quite easily to extract information which is in maybe all the tables. It's much easier. A spreadsheet, you can't really do this nearly as easily. You would have a massive VLOOKUP or massive index match. It's kind of confusing. So database is much better set up for extracting information from different but related concepts like events, records, and competitors. We could have also put things like, again, having this interface, having forms, having what's called a switchboard, like a menu really. Can do it in Excel too, or spreadsheets too. It's just more of a feature in databases, I would say. Okay, moving on to question 15. When a club record is broken at a competition, a club record certificate is produced. The competitor name, event name, and date from a database are merged into a desktop publishing certificate template. So this merge is telling us this is mail merge being used, which again, hopefully you tried yourself. Mail merge will be involved in your assignment more than likely. So what presentation method is this? So for a one marker like this, it's just going back to recall. So have you learnt what's on the spec? Well, the list I give in LO6 is, so graphs, charts, having an actual report, having user documentation. But the one it is we are using integrated documents. So it's an integrated document here. Integrated meaning we are mixing two different software types here. We're bringing some data from one software type into another software type. OCR love this to death, especially for the R013. If that's what's going on, we're moving data around, it's integrated, just one of the types here. If you didn't write this, you wouldn't get the mark because it's so specific for this. Just something you've got to learn. Right, but in terms of why this is good, why are they doing this? What are two advantages to progress harriers of using this method of integrated documents to create their certificates? They could have somebody opening up the database, opening up the certificate, and literally copying and pasting the stuff into the certificate. But the idea here is they're managing to create this mail merge, so it's taking data from here into your spreadsheet, into your whatever it is, desktop publishing, and it can produce certificates with actual values in, not just blank boxes or identifiers. So what are two advantages to them of using this more automatic process? Well, it being automatic, data is not having to be copied and pasted manually, will speed things up. So this can be automated. I'm thinking if somebody's copying and pasting, they would hopefully not make mistakes, but perhaps they're not even doing this. Maybe they're printing out a database and with paper in front of them, typing up the names and times into the template, which is prone to make mistakes. Even copying and pasting, you might leave off a few letters and it might lead you to have mistakes. So I've said if you are actually typing in these values manually, mistakes might be made, but if you have a direct connection to the database, this won't happen. Unless you've got a stored mistakenly in the database, it's not going to magically break on its way to your template. So it means this won't happen. Okay, let's just check this. Have we got 2 points for each answer? It looks like we do. And is it answering the question? Looks like it is. It is an advantage to the club, not to just anyone. Right, move on to, looks like a new scenario here. Hopefully we're almost finished. It's a long exam paper, as you would have noticed. So we have a large international charity collecting data relating to its 500,000 donors, people who give money to the charities, what a donor is. This data includes their names, contact details, and if a donor pays on a monthly basis. Is that relevant? Not really, I don't think, or is that likely going to be important? I'm not sure. But what it does do is promote the use of green energy, including the use of energy efficient home appliances such as TVs and lighting. I'm going to highlight this only because it's telling us what this charity is about. That might be useful to drop into our answers. Donors are encouraged to install solar panels on the roofs of their homes. The charity is collecting data on the public's opinion of a charity using the following. So that's pretty relevant. That's what we're framing this question about. So user surveys through the website. They've got a website, that might be important. They send questionnaires by email and or through the post. They use social media and other external sources like a market research company doing research on the street. They conduct this market research on a weekly basis using surveys and questionnaires. The data from this market research is shared with other fundraisers. Okay. And the data from the surveys and questionnaires is processed at the charity's head office and then stored on local servers. The charity uses the website to advertise the charity work it carries out and to sell branded clothing and gifts. Could be relevant maybe, and I think the fact that it's on a local server could be relevant. The idea of they've got their own computers storing all the data, it means it's really their job to secure it properly. And they have asked an IT company to review the IT systems it has in place to identify the impact and consequences of potential cybersecurity attacks. A lot of text to read, loads. So, first of all, the market researchers show presentations of the charity work to the people they talk to on the street. Potential donors are then asked to fill in an online questionnaire. Identify a suitable hardware device that could be used to complete the online questionnaire. So a hardware device is a physical computer, effectively. Software are things we can't touch. So what would be suitable here? Would a desktop computer be suitable? Well, no, because it's done on the street. So what could be held in hand, basically? A phone, a tablet, maybe a tablet is probably better, bigger screen. That's really what it's looking for here. And the data from each complete questionnaire is automatically sent to the charity's head office. Identify a suitable connectivity requirement for the hardware device you chose in the first part. So what do we need? What connection do we need for our tablet to be able to work with the system, to be able to send data automatically? Well, the tablet can't magically send data without some connection. What does it need? It needs a connection to the internet, but that's quite vague. So really, I would say things like Wi-Fi, maybe using a local shop's Wi-Fi, or things like mobile data you could write as well if the tablet's got a SIM card in, for example. 4G as well, 5G, good sort of things you could write. Internet's too vague here because, what kind of connection is it? Is it a wireless connection? Is it wired? There could be a wire plugged into this tablet, but most tablets don't have an Ethernet port or something like this. I think Wi-Fi is the best answer. And part B, we need to explain one implication to the charity of having bias in the questionnaire. Implication is sort of just one effect of having bias. In this case, bias is where you are kind of involving your own opinions in this case, a question. So maybe your question might be to the random people, why is it incredibly important to have green energy? And that's kind of a biased question. You're saying, why is it really important? A more objective question, a more unbiased might be, what do you think about green energy? Right? You're not trying to get your view across in your questions. What would happen if, say, questions had this bias in? Well, it would mean the questions are phrased in such a way that it will influence people responding to the survey. And this might mean the charity then gets inaccurate responses. The responses are not reflective of true public opinion because the people might have been influenced by the question itself. And so they might make mistakes because of not following or not finding the true public opinion. So I've said, the answers may be dishonest, especially if they're getting paid to answer the questionnaire. And the question is really obvious. If they want a certain answer, they might just give it. And so it's not honest. That doesn't affect the charity unless I then add in my next point saying, well, this means the charity collects inaccurate information or unreliable information. You can also say they're all quite similar, these terms. Inaccurate information, which means the charity might what are they doing here? And so this might mean, I'm trying to see what the scenario said, doesn't say too much about it, so it might mean they make wrong decisions based on this inaccurate information. So I've just changed what I just said, but it makes decisions based on it which don't truly reflect public opinion. Right, they've done what they want to do, they haven't done what the actual public wants, and so their business is not going to work as well, their charity is not going to work as well. So hopefully there's 3 points here for 3 marks, let's hope so at least. And it's to the charity, it's not, it could, if there's bias to someone responding, it might make them feel bad or make them feel pressured, but here it's to the charity we're writing about. So it's got a database for this charity containing the details of its donors. Identify 2 data types that could be used to store this information. In case of you having learnt the data types in LO3, things like alphanumeric, numeric, text, objects, boolean, limited choice. I'm sure there are others I've forgotten there. So let's just say alphanumeric. thinking about this scenario, in particular, alphanumeric could be things like postcodes, where we have a mix of letters and numbers, alphanumerical, and also, let's just say, numerical. Could write sort of sub data types of numerical, things like integers, reals, fractions, etc. But let's just keep it simple and say numerical. Things like age maybe might get stored here, or amount of money being donated. Could have said currency in that case then. We now need to do what is a really common question, is then just sort of elaborate on one of our choices here. So let's stick with alphanumerical, why not, and do what I said about the fact that postcodes might get stored which are a mix of letters and numbers. Okay, pretty easy here. One slight misconception sometimes, or mistake is maybe a better word, is people go, okay, 2 marks, I'm making 2 points, I make 1 point here, I make a 2nd point here. Well, actually, you won't get the first mark here because you're not going to get 2 marks for saying the same thing. Copying a word down does not give you another mark. The 2 marks are coming from your answer here. So really, I'm getting 2 marks for saying, well, postcodes, I'm kind of suggesting a valid reason here, and then saying why a postcode would be most suited to alphanumerical itself. So don't think you get a mark for the first bit. You don't, so just be careful. For question 18, we have another long marker. This one is 10 marks, so about the longest question you can possibly get, really. I think these are often really daunting, but because they're not marked just by ticking off like we just showed, they are easier because as long as your answer is coherent, like fits together well, and refers to the context and makes enough points, it's relatively easy to get the top marks in this type of question. So for this particular question, we're told a charity collects data about its 500,000 donors. Discuss the different ways in which the charity could use this data. So doesn't say how many we need to give. I reckon, the aim is to do generally half and hope each one is going to be 2 marks, so 5 points ideally. But like I say, this question is marked as a whole. So if I make 3 really good points, which are fully explained, like really well explained, that would get me 10 marks as well, as long as these points are in context, of course. So I would always advocate, like we did earlier, just doing a quick plan up to the side somewhere, like literally just jotting down a few ideas, just to get your ideas formed before you start writing. So for questions like this, you have got to think on your feet a bit, not something you can just memorise going into the exam, of course. So how could a charity use data about its donors? Well, thinking from a business perspective, which is what the exam body are really looking for, if a charity wants to make more money for the charity, then how is it going to be able to use these donors for an advantage? Well, a common thing that all businesses do when they have big-ish data is they're looking for trends. So look for trends in the data in the, would probably be a spreadsheet really, look for trends. And why are we looking for trends? Well, we want to see maybe who to target. They may have different advertising campaigns aimed at different sets of people, different demographics and so on, so they can use that to advertise a bit more intelligently. They could also, it doesn't say what the data is about, does it? It mentions some bits of data, so they do use surveys and questionnaires. So we could say as another point, they could use opinions to guide their kind of strategy, I suppose. Could mention that. So they could analyse the results and so on. What else could they do? Well, maybe on a related point, they could kind of use this data to kind of like evaluate or reflect on themselves. What have they done well, what have they done badly? And maybe on a more business point, I think did it mention clothing as well? I assume the clothing here is not, branded clothing gifts. So I assume it's not only for donors. I assume anyone can buy this. But maybe they can use the donor data somehow. Maybe they can track, how would you call it, merch purchases by the donors, maybe. And again, they could use that to, I don't know, decide the new stock, maybe. So they have some kind of stock control. Maybe they can predict when certain shirts are going to sell out and order more, or capitalise on certain designs, or whatever it is. I'll think more about the point as we start writing. Don't spend minutes on this, just start writing once you've got a few rough ideas. So let's first of all say the charity is able to analyse the data to look for trends. So it's good to be able to give examples in this case. Well, what might a trend be I don't know, maybe they notice that a lot of people donate around Christmas time, maybe they're feeling generous, whereas in March maybe not many people do, so they might look for high points and low points in the year and target adverts maybe at the low points. So I've just said, really, for example, they might look for times of the year where there are fewer donations given and target adverts people, especially during this time, to maybe make up for any lost donations. Could explain that more, but I think that will do for now. I think that makes sense, hopefully. And on a similar theme, they're able to use the data on a similar theme of this sort of targeted advertisement, which is really how most companies do things. They can also use the data and maybe change their advertising strategies based on demographics, based on age, gender maybe even. So I've said, they can use this information to target based on key demographics. For example, emailing information to younger donors. If it was found they were more likely to respond. I've said this may increase the impacts of the adverts sent. Again, probably could elaborate, and it'd probably be best too. But, thinking if this was a real exam, what could you realistically write? What did I say next? Well, we can use opinions collected in the market research to inform their strategy. Just sort of made up an example here. So I've said, they can analyse the data collected in surveys to help inform future campaigns. Remembering this is a charity after all, a charity campaign. So for instance, perhaps information revealed donors were particularly interested in a green energy source other than solar panels. It mentioned their focus was mostly on solar panels being installed on roofs. And so perhaps it would be more effective to change campaign and raise more money that way. So perhaps changing campaign would lead to more donations, which is really their goal. By the way, I did do a little drop-in to kind of show the examiner I understand a few concepts here. I've said, we're collecting data from the surveys. We receive data from the customers from a survey. But once it's analysed, once we're analysing it, we're processing it, right? And so it then becomes information. I've not just dropped these terms in anywhere. I have thought about data being processed leads to information. Hopefully that shows the examiner I am a higher ability candidate. That is a nice way of showing it. Always good to use key terms as long as they're used properly. My next kind of plan I jotted down was about evaluating themselves. So questionnaire could do this, but also looking at the donation patterns might also reveal how well they've done. So I've said the survey results would also allow the charity to self-reflect depending on donor feedback. I could elaborate here really, but then I moved on to a slightly separate point saying trends in donation timings would also reveal which previous campaigns were successful, enabling them to repeat these in the future. Maybe I could say, previous ad campaigns might make more sense here, but hopefully that makes sense, right? They can see maybe they did an advert in March and loads of donations came in April, and so that was successful. Maybe one in June did not really have much of an effect, so they could not repeat that. So I'm just going to say here, to make sure I'm really clear, this would result in more donations and reduce wasted money spent. Alright, so I haven't got much space left. I just said this word, missing off an I, this could result in more donations and reduce spending on strategies which were not successful previously. So I mentioned stuff about the stock, which I could try and cram in, but I think that's alright. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 points here. If each one's 2 and a bit marks, that gets me up to 10. Now it's not quite marked like this, as I've said a few times. It's marked using bands, so they're not looking for 10 points here. They're looking for, I say they, but the examiner are looking for, are you mark band 3, the top grade, mark band 2, or mark band 1. This will be like 1 to 3 marks. This will be like 4 to 6 and 7 to 10. So first of all, the examiner's going, okay, have they managed to have they kind of given a good answer? They've linked it to the context, talked about more than one way. That's mark band 3. So you're kind of guaranteed 7 marks. If it's context specific, if you've explained a few points, you'll guarantee the top mark. Now you might get 7 if your answer's a bit weak and you've only got maybe 2 reasons, but actually it's not hard to get up to the higher mark band, if not full marks, right? You can drop a few marks if you need to, but if you've got a full answer in context with your common sense, then you can get really high marks. So I think it's a very daunting question, especially because you see 10 marks and you see 2 lines or even 1 line of context here, and it doesn't tell you much at all. So it's really down to you to think on your feet a little bit. I don't know much about charities, but we can kind of think about what are some of the things and try and extract further bits of nuggets really from our wider context, even if it is a bit of a stretch sometimes. The examiner's not expecting you to know everything about a charity, but they want you to have some linking to real life context. Alright, so moving on to the last few questions in the paper, which is always a nice feeling. 19. State 2 types of environmental vulnerabilities which could affect the stored data. So environmental ones are really things which are out of our control as humans. Well, we can't control the environmental effect. We can limit the impact. We can mitigate. But things like fires, flooding, really natural events are environmental vulnerabilities. Things we can protect, but we can't really control necessarily. Obviously, if your data center got flooded, that would be terrible. If it got burnt down, it would be terrible as well. It is a major weakness. So for question 20, we need to explain the financial disruption which may occur to the charity after a cybersecurity attack. So a particular type of disruption is where things are not going as they should. Financial referring to money. So how will our money be affected if we have a cybersecurity attack? For 3 marks here. So we want 3 points, but linked because it is an explained question. So we're not told anything about the cyber attack, but let's assume that the cyber attack is maybe a denial of service attack or some other attack which causes the charity's systems to go offline. This is what we would call operational disruption. So it does say may here, we're not told much about it. Let's say perhaps. So I've said perhaps the attack results in downtime for the charity's website and email system. It's mentioned how important the email system is in particular. And this word is really good to use, downtime. The idea that the attacker may crash the systems, they may break, they may have got, if it was a flood, not really a cybersecurity attack, but they would get damaged, right? So they're not working. So I could say, as kind of my lead-in to my final point about how it affects the money, I could say this operational disruption may mean people wanting to donate are not able to. Therefore, the charity will not have this income during this period. So this is just one point you can mention. You know, there are loads of reasons why they would lose money. You could also mention, reputational loss. So reputational loss, people do not want to donate if they think their data is at risk. Maybe the attack is actually leading directly to financial loss. Maybe the attacker is managing to access the money somehow. Also, there's a cost to investigate. So the need to investigate and maybe pay for new systems will cost money as well. So all sort of things you could write about as long as you are explaining it. Because this doesn't say you need to explain one reason, you could, if you finish early, you could always go back and add one of these to your answer to make sure you're getting the 3 marks to guarantee it perhaps. Don't do this if it does say only it needs to be one reason. And is this a final question? It is. Good stuff. So the charity collects data on the use of solar panels by its donors with their permission. A green energy supplier has asked the charity to share this data with them. Explain 2 reasons why the charity should say no to this request. So quite a nice question. It's at 6 marks, so quite a lot actually here. So the key bit here, right, is the charity has got permission. So they've got the consent from the users, from the donors. But this consent was only to the charity. It wasn't to this random energy supplier. And so there are sort of 2 reasons here related to mostly the Data Protection Act. The idea that you will be very careful storing personal information about your customers, or donors in this case. I mean, you could go down the route of saying, one reason might be it's illegal because of this law and also it's unethical. You could go down that route. The idea that you should not be sharing data. But I think the legality is more important here because, it's not like it's a loophole. You aren't allowed to do this because, first of all, we could say this data could contain personal information. And I could say the Data Protection Act means it is illegal to share this information without their consent. And it's probably important to make clear that you understand they haven't given permission to do this. Okay, probably best to not actually go for another Data Protection Act point. We want to make sure our reasons are distinctive. So perhaps, why don't we go down the legal route, but maybe not. I think I'm avoiding the ethics only because I think the legal issues trump ethics in this case because it is against the law. But we could also mention, this is really, I suppose, a criminal case. This is a law the government set. But also we have civil cases, right? You can sue companies outside of criminal courts. You can sue for compensation. And so, part of the issue is, and it is covered in the Data Protection Act's work, part of the issue is the charity can't control anything done by this other company. They might have really good security, the charity, but this company might have terrible security. And if that company's security fails and there's a leak, the donors might blame the charity for giving it to the supplier. And so the donors could sue the charity instead of suing the supplier, or maybe they sue both, but it affects the charity if they get sued. So I'm going to say the charity cannot control what the supplier does with the data or how they can secure it. And so the donors could sue the charity if a cyber attack affects the supplier. So because the charity cannot control the supplier, the donors could sue the charity if the personal information is released. Well, why is this? It's because the donors only expected the charity to have their data, not anybody else. Okay, right, hopefully that's hopefully that's 3 points for each of our 2 reasons here. It's helpful doing it as different sentences. This looks like I've got a massive sentence down here. This is 2 points, really. What could they do? They could sue. And why is this? Because they only gave permission originally to the charity. And here, again, I've got a big second sentence, but I've given the law, which is usually a mark, quite frankly. And also I've explained about the consent is needed according to this law. So I have got these 3 points here. Just be careful. And now, having finished the paper, you can sit and relax, hopefully, at this point. But if you've got spare time, which you may well do, it may be 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes, maybe longer if you've managed to, if you're finding it really easy, go through and check every single answer. If you've got time, if you've got 10 minutes, 15 minutes, you've got time to check every single answer you've given. I'm sure when I edit this, I'll spot mistakes I made, which hopefully you would have spotted too. Everybody will make a mistake because you're in an exam situation, you're thinking hard about the questions. Check your answers. You're also checking to see, have you made as many points as the question is asking for? If it says one advantage, have you stated one advantage only? Do not state 2 advantages. It has no benefit, only a negative effect. Also, have you made as many points as the question is asking for? Really, 2 marks here is wanting 2 points. Only 1 advantage, but 2 points. You can kind of check this off in your head. Check questions where you could have made a mistake easily, like this one about evaluation versus execution. Think it through. But really, you are hunting for mistakes because everybody makes them and you don't want to be annoyed on results day. So bear in mind, you can drop a decent number of marks here, but you want to have a mentality if you don't want to drop any marks, ideally, of course. So have a go at every question. When it links it to when it mentions the context, the scenario, you better make sure your answer has that context too. Give examples if you need to, but you're going to make sure you're linking answers to the scenarios. And remember, if you are totally stuck, you can guess. It is harder to guess for 1 mark questions, admittedly. I mean, this one you probably could have guessed, what do you associate with environmental things, well, natural disasters, etc. But a lot of them, for longer mark questions, you can guess if you're not sure, but you still have to have learnt the key knowledge to be able to do well in this. But 1 or 2 questions you can guess, you can use common sense. You're not expected to know loads of things about the scenarios, but you are expected to think for yourself and think up how things might be in real life. So hopefully the exam goes really well. Try and prepare for it as much as you can and practice as many papers as you can. Use your mark schemes of a website to mark it officially, add up your marks and see how you did. So thanks for watching and good luck.